back to the Global Business Report here on Arise News. It's been all we've been talking about. It's been making headlines everywhere. Taxes, 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 reform, reform, reform. And of course, we have the overview of those tax reform bills. They've passed the second reading of the Senate. Let's take a look at the four of them that, of course, are going to hopefully change how Nigeria's fiscal structure. So we've got the Nigeria tax bill, we've got the tax administration bill, we've got the revenue service bill, and then the joint revenue board bill. So we did have the commissioner of finance for Ekiti State, Akintunde Oyebode, who joined us earlier on the Global Business Report. He's also the chair of the Forum of Finance Commissioners of Nigeria. So we first of all asked him what the objective is of that forum, and then got into the tax reform bills.
To organize and work together to ensure that we optimize first revenue optimization for subnationals. So think about things like peer review, peer learning. Obviously, we meet every month at FAC meetings.
Okay.
And so our role is really to provide some thought leadership on fiscal and sometimes monetary policy issues. We also help in advising the Nigerian Governors Forum on matters that have to do with fiscal policy, finance, etc. And as a group, we also work in ensuring that we do enough revenue assurance, that what ought to come to the Federation account comes to the Federation account and is distributed in line with the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria.
Fantastic. Hey, congrats again. Okay, so look, everybody's talking about the subnationals. Can you give us your assessment of these tax reform bills? How you're seeing them?
I mean, I think sadly a lot of the conversation has been overshadowed by the VAT derivation discussion.
Yeah.
But I think the first thing is I agree that our tax laws were in need of reform. We're working with tax laws that were handed on to us by the colonial government. These are laws that are pretty much a century old. Not fit for purpose, not fit for the time. So the question about reform is undeniable. Of course, with reform, there are various levels of engagement, and I think the committee, to be fair to them, did quite a bit of engagement. I think where they could have done a bit more was in exposing the draft bills, to various stakeholder groups like the Governors Forum, like the Commissioners Forum, etc., before, like the Joint Tax Board, for whom one of those bills directly affects,
right,
before the bills went to the National Assembly for consideration. I think that's a large part of why there seems to be a gap, because yes, there was some consultation, but consultation doesn't also show that the final document. When you have the final document, you also show those stakeholders that, look, this is what is going to the National Assembly, what are your concerns, what are your issues, even if you're not going to change them, but at least let them air their opinions before the bills go to the National Assembly. I think that's the only gap in the engagement process.
Speaking of the engagement process, we've got a clip of Taiwo Oyedele, who of course is the chair of the Presidential Committee on Fiscal Policy and Tax Reform, where he was talking to some chief financial officers, CFOs, and tax consultants. I want you to take a listen where he was talking about eliminating consumption tax and getting 5% of that going from the federal government, which gets 15%. So he says he wanted to get down to 10% and then give 5% to the states. I want you to just take a listen to what he had to say.
So this is the driver of our recommendation. Let me now go back to, this is the current regime of VAT, and this is what we are proposing. So I just explained this. There are also other states that are collecting consumption tax, entertainment tax, hotel center, event center taxes. They've invented different names for them. We think it's not appropriate for there to be more than one consumption tax per time. So we're encouraging the states to discontinue with their consumption tax. Of course, you would imagine the hardest to convince should be Lagos State. But I have to put this on record every time. Lagos State has been very supportive. They even gave us the numbers of, and I said, tell me how much you are collecting from consumption tax. It's actually not a lot of money. Of course, it will be a lot for smaller states. But by Lagos State standard, these numbers are barely 1 billion a month. So it's actually small. Say, why don't we just get rid of this other consumption tax? Let's just focus on VAT alone. So make it a sweetener for them. To the federal government, please, can you cede 5% of your VAT revenue to states So the federal government collects 15%, say start collecting 10. Let's give the extra 5% to states. When we did the maths, based on the VAT collection trend for 2024, that 5% is going to be close to 350 billion naira. It is more than 5 times everything the states are collecting from the consumption taxes. So honestly, if someone does not agree with our reforms, they have something else in mind that they're not telling us.
All right, so I want to get your reaction, but I also want to talk about these 4 bills in particular. But then, so what do you make of getting that 5% over to the states and getting, he says, 350 billion in estimates and so on?
Look, it's also important that we have fact-based or data-driven conversation.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So we, for example, have done some simulations. We do think that at certain levels, the disruption will be down to maybe 2 or 3 states, one of which is obviously Lagos, another is Rivers, right? But I think that's important for the simulations done by the committee to be presented for public scrutiny, right? So it's not enough to say we've done the numbers, you need to show those numbers, right? Now, we've seen numbers using the National Living Standards study that the NBS does, which gives you a good sense of consumption patterns across the country. That if, I think the proposal says the derivation should move from 20% to 60%. Now, my view is that that's a pretty steep move in one go. I think 2 things can be done. One is that the Revenue Mobilization and Fiscal Commission, right, should be leading this conversation, right? Because constitutionally, they are the body that speaks to revenue distribution and the indices and the methodology, etc. So I think that they should be taking a more frontal view, position as against an ad hoc committee, right?
Okay.
But I think more importantly is that conversation could easily, and I think there's room for negotiation, right? Where in my opinion, at 40% derivation, right, the disruption is much less, and is much less to maybe 2 or 3 states will earn less, right? So everybody earns more. So that's assuming 90% goes to subnationals and derivation is not more than 40% of that. Now, there are 2 things why, and I think we shouldn't cloud the conversation with ethnic or primordial sentiments, right? I think we lose the opportunity for progress. So when I see people say, hey, this is anti-one part of the country or not, I often laugh because actually the displacement is actually within regions.
Gotcha.
So if you say the northwest, northeast, southwest, southeast, south-south, north-central, you will find that the regional distribution of VAT doesn't change very much. Right? What changes is the distribution among the states in the region. Right? Now, if I take the Southwest, for example, right, based on derivation, Ekiti State contributes more than Ogun, Osun, and Ondo based on today's numbers.
Wow.
Right?
Okay.
There are reasons for that. So we can go into those reasons.
Yeah.
But we earn the list of all the states in the Southwest. Right?
Interesting.
So it means that we don't really get any benefits because we're small states. We're punching above our weight. We don't really get the benefit of that derivation, right? So the loss is actually not offset by other regions. It's going to be offset within that Southwest.
Yeah.
Right. So that's something that we all miss in the conversation. But I think that there's also an incentive in there where if derivation goes up by a bit, there's an incentive for actors to act in the right way. Right. I think the issue here has been the scale.
Yeah.
Of the reform on the VAT component, right? So I think that if you balance it out, you bring it down to say 40%, you show the numbers. We certainly have some numbers that we've seen that will suggest that at 40% it's less disruptive. That rising tide might lift all boats.
Yeah.
And that's minus the incentive it gives to actors to act in the right way, which ultimately will increase the size of the pie. I think for me the bigger issue should be today. We say we practice VAT, but it's really a sales or consumption tax, right? So it's really a sales tax because at every layer of the transaction, everybody charges the full amount.
Okay.
Right? I think that the question should be, how are we going to ensure that this is actually a value-added tax, right? Which will bring down the overall cost of the tax. So when people talk about inflationary pressure, etc., my response to that is always, today it's a sales tax, right? If we switch from sales to VAT, even if VAT goes up, as long as it's administered properly, right, the effect on cost today will be less.
Yeah.
Right? If you also think about the exemptions, right, in terms of food, critical
healthcare,
etc., you'll see that those things that really matter in terms of improving the quality of our lives have already been exempted, right?
Okay.
So again, I think the exemptions are significant. The whole idea here is to reduce what you tax, right? Make it a lot more transparent and bring a lot more people in. There are lots of companies today who charge VAT to their customers but don't remit, right? So getting that compliance level up is really the goal of this process. And then one thing I also like about the reforms that it's also looking to drop CIT.
Right, from 30 to 25.
So again, a CIT reduction makes Nigeria a more attractive tax jurisdiction.
Yeah.
Right? Because again, we often think that we exist in isolation, right? And many times our regulators often think that, hey, you know what, if you can't do business our way, then we're not good. You know, Nigeria is such a big country and such an attractive place. But we don't realize that we're competing for capital, right, with many other jurisdictions, right? So if you think about the oil and gas regulations, right, that the Special Advisor on Energy put out a year ago, right, you can see the investments that have come in and that are coming in post those regulations, right? You also need to support those kind of regulatory, initiatives with things like CIT reduction, right? Because it just makes Nigeria a more attractive tax jurisdiction. So I think there's an offset here where you're saying, you know what, we're going to take CIT down, we're going to take VAT up, but we're going to make sure it's a value-added tax and not a sales tax. So I think on a net effect basis, it's obviously positive, but I think there's obviously, some trust deficits, and a lot of that comes from, again, I'll say some gaps in the engagement process.
Okay, you mentioned, some companies charging VAT, not remitting. I want to ask you about technology, and there was a time where they was talking about VAT refunds, and he was praising, I think it was Rwanda or so. So here's what he said. I want to get your thoughts, and then maybe we'll talk about some other parts of the bill as well.
Burden of VAT, we've discussed that. Small businesses have smaller thresholds, so they have the burden. We've raised it. With our threshold, 97% will no longer have to worry about VAT. VAT refund takes forever. I spent over 20 years in the private sector doing consulting. I got tax refund only once in my entire career. In South Africa, you get refunds in 72 hours. Right? They proudly put the number of hours there. It's too embarrassing to put it in days. 3 days. In Rwanda, you get it before you apply. They just see your account and they see that your input is more than they credit you. Yeah, they just like, it must be that you're asking us to pay you, but you haven't had the time to ask. Yes. I'm extremely proud of Rwanda. They're the most impressive of all the countries, including foreign countries. Of all the countries we understudied, Rwanda Revenue Service is the most impressive. The way those guys use data is unbelievable. They even have how they categorize taxpayers. So this default payment is level A. So if you're a very compliant taxpayer, you get refund before you ask for it. And I think we can do that in Nigeria. Let's reward doing the right thing.
Okay, last time we had you on the show, you talked a lot about how Ekiti State is using technology and so on and so forth. So what is it possible we could get to the level of Rwanda or whatever? In terms of compliance and technology, how do you think that
I think, and that's why these laws are all exciting to me. I mean, as a package, not individually, they have some problematic provisions. I'll say in those 4 laws with 200 plus provisions, personally, I would say I have issues with maybe 9 or 10.
Okay.
Right? So it's not a substantial.
The whole,
In terms of technology, for example, the single window initiative for me is a game-changing initiative on the trade side, right? Gives you full visibility on trade transactions, makes it a straight-through process, right? You don't have to go through and if you've spoken to an exporter, right, they'll tell you how many places they have to go to, 15, 16 agencies, 25 permits, etc. Single window helps you to harmonize that, right? Now that's a big part of the reform play, right? That doesn't get spoken about. In my opinion, probably going to be a massive game changer, for import-export, for trade, international trade. I think that we also will end up with a national e-invoicing model, right?
Okay.
Something similar to what happens in Mexico, happens in Brazil. So Latin America has done that quite well.
Yeah.
And they've ensured full-on compliance, right? From the guy on the street, the mom and pop shop, everybody's invoicing electronically. And if you're not, you're basically locked out of the banking system, right? I think that when we get to that level, right, this helps, right, in getting people, the law helps in setting, the scene. And I think that's something that you can then lay on top of a good law, right? Which then means that you just raise compliance levels significantly.
Yeah.
Things like a unified tax ID, super important, right? Whether you're in Ekiti, Lagos, Ogun, Abuja, you have a tax ID, you can transfer it, it's interoperable. One of my pet peeves, for example, is you pay taxes in Lagos.
Yeah.
You want to buy land in Ondo or you want to buy land in Kaduna. Then you go there, they say you have to come and pay something again, right?
Yeah.
Well, you're a fully compliant taxpayer in one country, right? So that interoperability, I think, is a big deal. And those are some of the things that I think some of the provisions here are trying to fix, which is why I always say, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? The laws, the bills, because they are not yet laws, the bills themselves are fundamentally sound, right? There are always, with 4 bills coming at one go, there will always be concerns, right? But there's a need to still, and I think that National Assembly process, the process of even showing dissent, right? Whether it's from governors, whether it's from National Assembly, it helps to refine, the end goal, right? So you don't expect people to take things hook, line, and sinker, right? Once you put bills out there, they are proposals.
Right.
They should be debated, right? That's part of a democratic process, right? At the end of that process, there will be some trade-offs. I'm giving you an example here now, on the derivation part, right? So, but ultimately, I think the things that help to drive, technology, for me, are the most exciting things. And I think that the single window could potentially be the most transformative business reform of this administration, if fully implemented.
Speaking of which, these 4 bills, how do you see the implementation process? How do you see that playing out?
The first have to be passed, right? Yeah. So the passage is obviously work in progress. But I think it's also going to take some time to implement in its entirety. For example, when the chairman of the committee talks about derivation, right, and being able to, map derivation to the point of consumption, it's not as simple,
right,
as it's been said, right? Financial services, for example, my account is open in Lagos, I live and work in Ekiti. Where does that VAT go to? What's the process for sometimes, dispute resolution, etc., between states, all that stuff. So there's work to be done. But I think that if you think about the largest VAT payers, right, it's fairly easy. The telcos, where a call is originated, where a browsing session is originated, they can give you all that data and disaggregate, the FMCGs will tell you where their goods are going to. So there's a part of it that, you can fairly quickly assess. But I think for me, the big part of it is increasing compliance on even governments paying VAT, right? So state governments, local governments, etc., right? When you give out contracts, do you deduct the VAT? Do you remit? Right. And if you then get a higher derivation component, there's a lot more incentive for you to ensure full compliance, even as governments, because government must lead, right? If you're asking companies to comply, you as government must show sufficient evidence that you're fully compliant with the laws of the land that you're enforcing.
Fantastic. Hey, look, let's drill down into Ekiti State. Look, the numbers tell the story here, and I want to just ask you about that. So, looking at, we went through the MBS Bureau of Statistics data, your IGR, tax revenue, others all have jumped. Your internally generated revenue from 2022, 17 billion, pretty much doubled to 32 billion. In fact, it's tripled since 2020. Tax revenue's gone up. Others, tech categories, it's all there on the screen. Explain to us. So, what's been the triggers behind that?
Full disclosure, obviously 2022 low base, COVID obviously did a number on our revs. In the last 12 to 18 months, a bunch of things have happened, right? So the chair of our Internal Revenue Service, to whom most of this credit goes to, Mr. Niro Latono. You should have him on your show sometime.
Okay, well,
great guy. Was hired professionally. We got a big 4 consulting firm to run that recruitment process. He came first. He got the job. I'd never met him. He had never met the governor.
Oh wow.
Got the job on merit. And obviously that merit-based recruitment government trickle down to his C-suite execs, right? And they then had the, liberty and freedom to hire people based on competence, right? So the service has full autonomy. They also get 10% of whatever they collect as an incentive, right? Part of that is used to improve their technology. Part of that is used to improve their infrastructure. Part of that is a bonus to their staff. But as we do much better, as that pie gets bigger, that number will start to come down, right? And that's the idea, right? So you start them on a high commission, and as the numbers grow significantly, that, you basically use a best of judgments to say, this is a figure that we think makes sense. And as that number obviously quadruples and goes up 8x, you don't then want your cost of collection to go up 8x, right? So that starts to come down. But that's a lot of what we've done. Obviously, we've used quite a bit of technology as well. We've changed our collection systems. We've made it easier, USSD, mobile, web, etc. We've brought in guys like Paystack, Flutterwave. It's omni-channel now. Whereas 2 or 3 years ago, you had to go into a bank or into the IRS office, otherwise you couldn't transact.
Fantastic. All right, so look, I want to get your final question for you. Your outlook for 2025. We're asking all our guests. I guess for Ekiti State and also for Nigeria at large, how you see things playing out next year.
I shy from giving opinions and predictions on air, right? Because someone's always going to play this to me in H2 25 to say, hey, you got this wrong. But look, I think we've turned the corner. Obviously very worried about prices, still very worried about inflation. I think the money supply overhang hasn't left us. Unlike many people, I don't think ours is largely cost push. I think our inflation is demand pull, and we're still suffering from excess money supply over the last, I'll say, 36 months. So the central bank definitely has a tough job on its hands, just trying to manage that. But I think that there are a number of things that are very important for the country. We need to close a number of big oil and gas investments, right? I think if we close 2 or 3 big deals, if we're able to take production up to 1.6, 1.7 million barrels per day on a consistent basis, not a one-off 1.8, so consistently to 1.7 million barrels per day, even at moderated oil prices of $70, $65 per barrel, I still think that you'll see that the macro continues to improve. Of course, ultimately, the point with growth is that no one eats growth, right? People want jobs, people want affordability, people want to boost productivity. And I think for me, the elephant in the room is, how does agri do, right? Agri now is growing at circa 1%, right? I think that is a disaster, right? There's nowhere where your agri sector grows at 1% where you don't have massive food inflation, right? So that's, I think, for me, if there's one problem, I think that both national and sub-national governments have to tackle, it will be agriculture. In Ekiti, for example, we are very keen on solving that problem. A few days ago, we released, I was a member of the Committee on Food Security, and we've now started implementing that report. And it starts with land clearing, just ensuring that there's more land banks available for agriculture, helping farmers get better inputs, building storage facilities to ensure that we minimize post-harvest losses. And we've also set up a trading and distribution company, right, to buy excess produce from farmers during the harvest season. So it's a bunch of things that we are doing as a state. And I see other states doing many other different things.
Doing that thing.
Benue, Niger. So different people are doing different things. And hopefully, the subnational collaboration, helps to grow the agri sector. But I think there's also a need for better national cohesion around how we solve the agriculture problem. The AFDB special agro processing zones should help. I think the first 7 or 8 states are now about to start implementation, but these are longer term solutions, right? You don't see the outcome for another 2 to 3 years. But I do think that agriculture is where we sink or swim in 2025. And if there's one advice to the president, it'll be, you should almost be a instead of being a pseudo petroleum minister, you should actually be a pseudo agri minister.